leading up to the Revolutionary War. And of course, we're going to start with that French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is basically Britain versus France. Britain with the Iroquois as allies, France with other Indian tribes. It lasts from 1754 to 1763 and is an extension of the 7 Years' War in Europe. This is going to result in colonial trade empires. Okay, you can kind of see all this territory that is in dispute at this point in time. Okay, so let's talk about the clash of empires. It kind of begins with something called the War of Jenkins' Ear. I want you to look at that video. It kind of gives you a background, but it's a confrontation right off the coast of Georgia between Spain and England. And it leads to the War of Austrian Succession, which is called King George's War. And now France is aligned with Spain, England versus Russia. We've got all of that going on over in Europe. So the French have the Ohio River Valley is just teeming with fur, and it's an area that the English are moving over on, the English colonies, and the French are worried about the English coming over on what they consider to be their property. So they build this string of defensive forts, and the main one is it's actually pronounced Fort Duquesne. So the British governor of Virginia, he dispatches a guy named George Washington to kind of solidify British claims on this area, and off George goes. So in 1754, George Washington gets to about 40 miles from Fort Duquesne. He encounters some French troops, and he kills the French leader. Well, he and his troops do. He builds a fort, which wasn't much of a fort, but it was called Fort Necessity. And George loses the first of many battles, actually, that he's going to lose. He has to surrender. And technically, this is the first battle, the Battle of Fort Necessity of the French and Indian War. So the result is this is an international incident now, and the Virginia and British expansionists demand war with France. They're looking at that territory. Over in Europe, England and Prussia versus France, Spain, Austria, and Russia is involved. Frederick repels the French, Austrian, and Russians and becomes Frederick the Great. In the meantime, Ben Franklin, he creates the first American political cartoon, an effort for unification. This is a cartoon you need to remember, Join or Die. So you can see the cut up snake here, and basically he's saying that the colonies have to get together or they will not survive. So in 1754, 7 of the 13 colonies meet in Albany, New York, and basically they're kind of strategizing what's going to go on with the war. They meet with Iroquois chiefs, and they want to keep them loyal, and they end up giving them 30 wagon loads of gifts to buy their loyalty. There was some liquor involved there. They talk about raising an army, and of course the name George Washington comes up. Remember, he's only in his early 20s at this point. How to protect their cities, could they raise money by taxation, and as it turned out, these states, which aren't states yet, the colonies, would not give up their sovereignty. Benjamin Franklin had proposed that they create some sort of unified government, but the proposal was rejected. So this is kind of showing Ben over there on the right and meeting with these Indian chiefs and kind of getting together with them and getting a battle plan. In the meantime, up north, the Acadians are being kicked out of their region. The British required all residents to swear allegiance to Britain or leave, and these were French Acadians, and they are kicked out, and basically many of them die actually, but they go down the eastern seaboard and as we all know, get as far as South Louisiana, and these folks are known as the Cajuns. So we have a very, very beautiful culture thanks to these Acadians, and I have posted this video for you to look at. Okay, so this is kind of showing, this is Nova Scotia, and that is where the Acadians are going to be expelled from and make their way to the south. But this is the French and Indian War, and this kind of shows the major battles. You can see the French victories and the British victories with the stars here. Now we are not doing real well. Washington, we'll talk about that, is going to lose another one. British are going to surrender here, but these are going to be the key battles up here in Canada, and we will talk about how that happened. So, England sends a guy named General Edward Braddock. He's 60 years old. He believes in strict military procedure. They fight in lines. They march in lines. And in the meantime, the French are hiding behind trees and using what they called Indian tactics. George Washington is a colonel under General Braddock, and he is trying to warn him, but Braddock doesn't listen. During the course of the battle, 2 horses are shot out from under Washington. They find later 4 bullets through his coat, and yet he is not wounded, and Braddock is killed, and George Washington's reputation soars. The Indians kind of go crazy, and they are scalping on both sides. So the savagery of the Native Americans is exaggerated. Back in England, they get a new Secretary of War named William Pitt, and he is brilliant. His nickname is the Great Commoner, or the Organizer of Victory. And he says, this isn't working. So he makes some major changes, and he sends the British ships over to cut off supplies. Then he directs his army to attack Montreal and Quebec. He replaces his old officers with young ones, and this is going to be the turning point of the war. So a young officer named James Wolfe, only 32, he organizes, this just didn't happen, night attacks. And Quebec is on the water, and there's a cliff, and they scaled these cliffs at night, and it was a brilliant, brilliant military move. It's called the Battle of Quebec on the Plains of Abraham, and this is going to be the most significant English victory of the war. Sadly, James Wolfe is killed. So, what are the results? This war actually, it ends about 1760, but it takes about 3 years to get the peace treaty signed, and they have the Paris Peace Treaty of 1763, and basically France is out of North America. The British get all of the territory east of the Mississippi River. Spain ends up with New Orleans, which is going to go back to France again. And then the only territory the French retain are some islands in the West Indies. Britain establishes itself as the leading naval power in the world. So you can see all this territory that the French are giving up, and now the colonies, well, actually the British Empire and the colonies have all the territory all the way to the Mississippi River, except for New Orleans. Okay. All right. So, what are the effects? For the first time, the colonies had cooperated with one another. Although the Albany Congress was not successful, they did meet with one another. We now have George Washington establish himself as a magnificent military officer, and then there are others that we're going to draw upon for the Revolutionary War. Also, we saw the British as kind of these haughty, not as formidable force as they were perceived to be before. We'd moved over into the Ohio River Valley. We saw the beautiful land, and now people wanted to move to the west. And that term American, which the English used rather derisively, but came to be kind of a word of praise, with and people seeing themselves not as British anymore, but as something very different. Okay, some more effects. The British officers and the American officers did not get along as far as tactics went, and the English kind of looked down on the American officers. They forbid, because remember mercantilism, all supplies are supposed to go to the mother country, and they said you couldn't trade in between your colonies, and of course that's not going to go very well. And smuggling, a guy named John Hancock's going to be one of the big smugglers. Now colonists are free to go over the Appalachians and wanting to move west, and the Indians lost their French allies. So these are effects, and now it's going to be a little bit different because the British are not going to be fighting anymore over there in Europe, and now they're going to be concentrating a little bit more on their colonies and wanting to get a little payback. And we all know how that's going to end up. So that's the next thing we're going to talk about, and that's just an overview of the French and Indian